Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual meeting of the Midwestern Legislative Conference Economic Development Committee. Today's topic is creating jobs and business through science and innovation. I'm Laura Tamaka with CSG Midwest, and I serve as the staff liaison to the Economic Development Committee. On behalf of all of my colleagues here, thank you for taking time to join us this morning. It's certainly nice to be able to see many of you again, even if only virtually, and we're grateful that you've chosen to spend some of your valuable time with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items so everyone knows how today's meeting will proceed, as well as how to best engage with us using the Zoom tools. Today's webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be available later today on the webinar page of csgmidwest.org. Please note that all attendees have entered the meeting in a muted mode, and we will ask that you remain muted when not speaking to help avoid any unnecessary background noise. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions and make comments during today's event, and our hope is that you'll take advantage of this opportunity for engagement throughout. If you lose your connection to the meeting, here are a couple of things you can do to try to reconnect. Close Zoom and reconnect using the meeting link that was sent to you by email earlier today. If that doesn't work, try to reboot your computer or device and then reconnect using the same link. If you're unable to reestablish internet connection, you can call into the meeting at 312-626-6799 and participate by phone. These tips also appeared in writing in the final pre-meeting message that was emailed to you this morning, so please refer to that if you need any assistance. Here's a screenshot of the Zoom toolbar, which you can display by simply moving your cursor over the Zoom window. The toolbar is where you can mute and unmute your audio, stop and show your webcam, view the full participant list, and access the chat window. The chat window is where you'll be able to submit questions as the meeting proceeds. All of our presenters may pose a couple of questions to the group during their presentation, and if they do, you'll use that chat to submit your answers at that time. In addition to using the chat feature to ask questions, you can request to speak to the group by raising your hand, and our staff will help call on folks to monitor that discussion. Our presenters have asked that you feel free to either send your chats at any time or raise your hand, and as we identify those questions, we'll pause and we'll take them throughout their presentation. To raise your hand, click on the participant icon to open the list of meeting participants. There you'll find a hand icon next to your name. Simply click it, and that will alert us that you'd like to speak to the group. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to today's moderators, the co-chairs of the MLC Economic Development Committee, Nebraska Senator John McCollister and Ohio Representative Dave Greenspan. They will help guide us through the rest of today's meeting. Thank you, Senator McCollister and Representative Greenspan, for your committee leadership and for your participation today. Senator McCollister, I'll now turn things over to you.
They've done leading up to today, and thank all of today's attendees for taking time out of their day to join us for this discussion. We are very fortunate to have today's event on creating jobs and businesses through science and innovation, co-hosted by the State Science and Technology Institute. SSTI, which is based in Ohio, is one of the nation's leading voices on the role and importance of science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship in today's economy. During today's event, we'll hear presentations by two of SSTI's experts on the building blocks of regional innovation economies, the partners and organizations involved in innovation economies, and the policies and resources that support innovation and entrepreneurship in our states and communities. Finally, we'll have questions and answers, as well as a chance for discussion among you, our participants, and our experts. Now I'd like to welcome today's presenters from SSTI. Dan Berglund is the president and CEO of SSTI and has led the organization since 1996. He has helped SSTI develop a nationwide network of practitioners and policymakers and works with the states and communities as they build tech-based economies. Prior to joining SSTI, Mr. Berglund worked as a consultant and for the Ohio Department of Development in a variety of positions, including acting Deputy Director of the Division of Technological Innovation. Joining Mr. Berglund for today's presentation and discussion is Jason Rittenberg. Mr. Rittenberg is the Policy and Development Director for SSTI. He coordinates SSTI's policy activities, cultivating partnership and project opportunities, and contributing to the SSTI Weekly Digest. Mr. Rittenberg previously conducted research for the Council of Development Finance Agencies, the Ohio Development of Job and Family Services, and the Klein Center for Democracy. He is co-author on News on the Internet, Information and Citizenship in the 21st Century. Thank you both for being with us today to lead us through this conversation. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Senator, thank you very much for the introduction. Appreciate it. Jason, if you want to go ahead and show the slides. There we go. Title slide. We can move on to first slide on about SSTI. So just a little bit of background on SSTI. As the Senator mentioned, we're a national nonprofit organization based in Ohio, but we work with organizations across the country. Also excited to see a number of registrants from Canada as well, and would love to have a further dialogue with our Canadian friends about the work they're doing. So SSTI's mission is to strengthen initiatives to create a better future through science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We do that through information and services that are needed to succeed in today's innovation-driven economy. And a large part of our focus is to share lessons learned so that people are not recreating the wheel, but rather learning from each other. Our funders include the Kauffman Foundation, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, and more than 150 state, local, university, and nonprofit organizations across the country. Let's go on to the next slide. So I want to spend a little bit of time just laying the groundwork for the elements that are required for a tech-based economy. And different organizations have different lists. I tend to use this list of 7 items, and Jason and I are going to walk through some of the issues that are involved on a number of these. So the very first thing is that if you're going to have a tech-based economy, you better have a source of ideas and some research capacity. And that can come from a variety of organizations. It can be universities, federal laboratories, companies, nonprofit research institutes. It's great if you've got a source of ideas, but you still need to get those ideas out into the marketplace. You need to convert those ideas into new products, companies, and jobs. And that can be through formal tech transfer mechanisms from universities and federal labs, or it can be the informal networks and the informal exchange of people. So if you're really passionate about this topic, one book that I would recommend is Regional Advantage by Annalee Saxenian. Dr. Saxenian's work looked at the development of Silicon Valley and Route 128. And one of the things that she captures in that book is a great description of the importance of informal networks in Silicon Valley and the free exchange of people jumping from a university to a company to another company and taking ideas with them. So in addition to those first two elements, you also need a workforce with appropriate skills. And you also need a source of financing to make all of this work. Financing for startup companies, financing for the growth and expansion of companies. And of course, infrastructure is critical as well. And that means, in this case, we're talking about having high-speed broadband internet access, but you still have to get from point A to point B. As much as we're doing Zoom meetings, I know all of us are anxious to actually getting back to being able to meet with each other face to face. And in order to do that, you've got to get from point A to point B. These first five things are things that are relatively easy to measure. The next two items are much more difficult to measure. So if you're going to have a tech-based economy, you need to have an entrepreneurial culture. What exactly does that mean? How do you define that? The best definition that I heard on this years ago was that if you gathered all your friends and family in a room and you announced to them that you were quitting your job and you were starting a new company, if they applauded, you were in an entrepreneurial culture. And honestly, this is one of the biggest challenges that the Midwest has, is the Midwest region, and I was born and raised in Illinois, moved to Ohio, so I'm a native Midwesterner. But it's the biggest challenge I think that the region has is not having a vibrant entrepreneurial culture. And then the final element that's required is a high quality of life. In particular, having that skilled workforce is so critical for a tech-based economy now. And in order to attract and retain that workforce, you have to have a high quality of life that's going to appeal to those kinds of workers. Let's go on to the next slide. So we talk some about tech-based economic development, and I just want to spend a couple minutes defining what it is that we mean when we say tech-based economic development. Really, it's an approach that's designed to encourage the creation and growth of technology companies. And I want to make a special note, because this frequently gets confused. Technology companies are not just IT companies. They're not just information technology companies. So when I talk about technology, companies, I'm talking about IT, I'm talking about biotech, I'm talking about advanced manufacturing, I'm talking about any company that has a higher than average number of employees in STEM occupations, or spends higher than average on R&D. Beyond the creation and growth of technology companies, one role of tech-based economic development is also instilling technology in all companies. So how do you best make those companies competitive? Our emphasis really is on growing your own companies rather than recruitment, although recruitment of companies can certainly play a role in jumpstarting or helping expand a technology-based economy. So ultimately, the goal is to create an environment where technology firms will be created and thrive without government action. One of our members at one point described it as really what we're trying to do is something that's organic rather than synthetic. And I think that was a nice capsulization of the field. Let's go on to the next slide. So why do this? I think for some folks this is self-evident, but I think it's also important to just spell it out. That reasons to do it include, in order to compete in today's global economy, you need these kind of companies, in particular where lesser skilled and lower wage jobs that could be outsourced have been sent overseas. To diversify one's economy so it's not overly dependent on just one industry, we keep a close eye on what's going on in all of the states, and as a result of the pandemic, the budget situation in a number of states is particularly severe. So we look at those states that are dependent on just natural resources, mineral extraction, oil, or tourism as states that have significantly more severe budget problems. So growing your tech-based sector can help diversify the economy. As I mentioned before, it also helps to make existing industries more competitive. These companies create higher paying jobs with better benefits. It's a tool that will retain or attract people to your area. And it's also a mechanism to address critical issues affecting both your area and the world overall. So whether that's specific health issues, climate change, income disparities, racial inequities. Let's go ahead on to the next slide. So as Jason and I were preparing this presentation, the question was posed to us about clusters. And I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about clusters and or tech innovation, because they sometimes get used interchangeably. But really, clusters are a specialized concentration of companies, suppliers, workers, and supporting services. So it's easiest to think of clusters as, yes, Silicon Valley is a tech cluster, but Napa Valley is a cluster for wine. Hollywood is a cluster for entertainment. Firearms manufacturing has a cluster in South Dakota. Water technologies in Milwaukee. So clusters don't have to be technology companies, but conversely, just because you have technology companies doesn't mean that you have a cluster. And the literature shows that clusters that work in traded goods sectors pay higher wages than the average company. They can build off of a competitive advantage of an area. And as I mentioned before, in general, on tech-based economic development, they can result in a lack of economic diversification, making economic downturns more severe. So the example here is any place that you have a tourism concentration, a tourism cluster, it can be hard hit. Michigan years ago had Michael Porter, who's sort of the guru of clusters in the US, do an analysis of the economy in Michigan and make a recommendation. Professor Porter's recommendation was that Michigan had an automotive cluster and it should invest in that automotive cluster. The governor and the legislature reacted to that, saying, in essence, we know we have an automotive cluster. We need to diversify our economy. And so started working more on the life sciences to supplement the work that was already clustered around automotive manufacturing. Let's go on to the next slide. So I think as you're considering any work to create jobs and companies through science and innovation, there's some first steps that you need to take. And you need to look at what strengths either your region, and here when I'm saying region, I mean at a sub-state level. So what strengths your region or your state currently has. And in particular, I really want to understand what's the research capacity in this area, what's your entrepreneurship base like, and what's your workforce like. Those three things, I think, in a lot of ways are most difficult to change because they take longer periods of time. Tools like capital, converting research, broadband, and quality of life, those are all things that government can intervene on and direct resources to have an impact. So in some respects, I think they're a little bit easier to deal with than the first three things. So in addition to looking at the strengths, I also want to think about what challenges your region has. What gaps exist? And here doing a mapping of who's doing what to provide what kind of assistance in the region is going to be important. And again, going back to the point about the ultimate goal is to have government out of the mix, where it's purely organic and it's the private sector that is driving all of this, is what can be done to change private sector behavior. So how do you go about doing some of these things? You know, statistical analysis, interviews, roundtables with stakeholders. But let's talk about some caution, some words of advice as you pursue this. As I wrote that bullet point about you want to do interviews and roundtables with stakeholders, I flashed back to 35 years of doing those things. And if you meet with an entrepreneur, the very first thing they're going to tell you they need is money. For 35 years, that's what I've heard from entrepreneurs. So just, and that's not to say that they're wrong, just be prepared, that's what you're going to hear. In general, I would stress just because somebody else, some other region is doing something, doesn't mean that you should do it. So your programs and policies should be based on evidence rather than, oh, that looks like an interesting approach over in North Carolina, or Boston did this, let's copy that and do that. I think all of the states in this region have some kind of school of public administration. You have economics programs, you have business programs, which means you've got grad students that are looking for thesis topics and dissertation topics. So you can use those students to help you determine which program or policy might make the most sense for your particular region. Keep in mind that tools doesn't equal strategy. There's always a rush ahead to, we should have this kind of program, or we should have this kind of incentive. But it really needs to tie to what your overall strategy is. As legislators, I would encourage that you demand accountability from the executive branch and external evaluation of these programs. I mean, I tell my members every year at my annual conference, I conclude it with 4 things that they should do when they go home. They should do good work. They should measure the work that they're doing. They should tell people about the work that they're doing, and they shouldn't do anything stupid. And the anything stupid is, don't get into ethical problems. Use common sense. But it's critical that this external evaluation be done. But that also means, as legislators, if you're providing funding for these programs, you need to also provide the resources for them to be able to do the evaluation, because it's not cheap to do. I would also keep in mind, every governor wants to create something new to have as his or her new legacy. And so just keep in mind that a lot of times the best solution to addressing issues in a region is actually providing more resources to an existing organization rather than creating a new organization. And then the final caution is silos exist. You know this, all of the practitioners know this. It's in both the legislative and the executive branches. And so you, I think, as legislators and the governor as an individual have the best opportunity to break through those silos. And let's go to the next slide so that I can explain exactly what I'm talking about here. So one of my colleagues at SSTI developed this. Thinking about it, there are really 4 verticals for regional prosperity policy. There's community development, which deals with housing and neighborhoods. There's workforce development, which deals with training, getting the right set of skills. There's economic development, which people tend to think of as recruitment or Main Street businesses. And then there's tech-based economic development. Problem is, as practitioners, we tend to focus in each of our own silos and don't cross this. But now, more than anything, if you look at workforce development, if you look at the issues in tech-based economic development, we need a skilled workforce. So a partnership between the workforce development silo and tech-based economic development is critical. I talked about quality of life. That's where community development comes into play as well. So part of the question for you all as legislators is, how do you cross these 4 silos? So Jason, let's go on to the next slide. So after I warned, don't take ideas from another region just because they're out there and they seem like good things. I know people are interested in what's going on in other regions. So Jason and I are going to spend some time giving some examples of this. So if you need to increase R&D capacity in a state, there are a number of examples. Kentucky has a program that they call Bucks for Brains, where they recruit eminent scholars to their university system. The Georgia Research Alliance developed a similar program, their Eminent Scholar program, but very focused just on those areas of existing industrial relevance in Georgia. Couple states have invested in basic research in hopes of seeding whole new industries. So a number of years ago, California voters approved a $3 billion bond issue to create the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. You can tie university capabilities to industry problems and needs. So University of Maryland's Industrial Partnerships Program is a great example of this. Basically, if a company has a technical problem, they can go to University of Maryland, get a little bit of state funding to get resources from the university to help solve that technical problem. And then on converting ideas, again, the Georgia Research Alliance is a great model of accelerating the launch and growth of university enterprises. So what the Georgia Research Alliance has done is taken small amounts of money, hired industry folks to go into universities, scout for ideas that might have commercial potential, and then provided follow-on funding, proof of concept funding to further develop that idea. And one of the important things that GRA learned that is important for the field overall is that even though researchers may disclose an idea to a university technology transfer office, they're disclosing an idea of what they think the commercial potential might be, but by having external folks with industry experience come in, they look at the technology with a fresh set of eyes, and GRA has been able to dramatically increase the number of technologies that have been commercialized as a result. Let's move on to the next slide. I talked about workforce. I just want to mention on workforce, I was at a meeting about a year and a half ago with state economic development directors where they said, we're going to spend an hour and a quarter talking about the workforce problem. And it was the most frustrating hour and a quarter that I had spent, because they were all talking at cross purposes to each other. Not because they weren't well-intentioned people, they very much were and are. It's just each of those states had different workforce problems. So what I would encourage you all, as you hear either from companies or from economic developers, we have a workforce problem, is to really drill down on that. What exactly do you mean when you say you have a workforce problem? Is it a long-term problem? Is it a short-term problem? Do we have high unemployment? Are people underemployed? Are we talking about diversity and inclusion? What's our pay level like? Has that been addressed? Are we doing on-the-job training? Are we doing apprenticeships, internships? Are we retaining people in our area? Are we attracting people in our area? So this workforce issue is just a huge area. And I think the critical thing really is to define it in order to have a meaningful conversation. I'm going to turn the rest of the presentation over to Jason, who will talk about entrepreneurship and capital. Jason?
Great, thank you. So Dana mentioned earlier entrepreneurial culture and the importance of making sure that you have that in your community, although unfortunately it's difficult to assess in some ways, and certainly difficult to say that there is a policy solution that's going to be able to flip a switch and develop an entrepreneurial culture. essentially, as Dan was alluding to, what you're talking about is making sure that people are willing to take risks. And on the flip side of that, that failure isn't stigmatized. What you see with many successful companies is that they end up not having their initial business model work out, and there's a pivot at some point where they've changed direction. Or you see entrepreneurs that maybe it's not their first, it's their second, third, fourth company that's the one that really hits it big and makes them into the success that we recognize. And so it's really important that people are willing to take that risk and understand that failure can be a lesson rather than the end of their existing strategy or career. So because it's not something that you can just change easily with a single program, what we're talking about from a policy standpoint is how do you create the structure and how do you influence the signals that support entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs to make them willing to take those risks. And so we're talking about looking at ways to provide access to social networks, to facilities that can provide support, to different technologies and ideas, to markets, and ultimately to capital that can help to grow a new venture. So when we're looking at, there are several components of this. When you're looking at people, there can be strategies around bringing in new talent to a community. And especially it tends to be important to have not just, your series of your initial entrepreneurs, but is there enough of a bench in the community that rest of the C-level can get built out as well? That if the first company doesn't work out, that entrepreneur that you're trying to recruit knows that there would be another company that they could go to. And so you want to get to the point where you're building up a bench of both talent and new companies. You can do things through initiatives to provide mentoring, to provide coaching, so that your entrepreneurs know a little bit more about what they need to do. We see many times, whether it's someone coming from a university or from industry, that maybe they're a great idea person, they have developed a new technology, a new piece of hardware, whatever it may be, that has commercial potential, but that might not be the right person, especially without coaching, to run and grow a business. So do you have the means within your region to be able to get that person better educated on the business aspects, or to be able to partner them up with someone else who does? Being able to connect people with capital is really important, and that goes both directions. One, helping your entrepreneurs to understand sources of capital within the region, and especially capital that's willing to take a risk, that's not going to be looking at a balance sheet that already looks pretty solid. For example, like you might see at some larger banks, but take a risk on a newer company. But the flip side of that is that the region also needs to be focused on making sure that it's high net wealth individuals, that it's Fortune 500 companies, whatever it may be, that those people who have deep pockets are willing and actually making investments. So pulling together angels, pulling together, whether that's a network of angels or making connections between the funds that you have that are looking to invest in these types of companies, that they're making connections to the larger companies, again, that they'll be willing to put money in. That's something that can also be important, that the state might be able to play kind of a convening role to help that actually occur. So we see again and again in areas that don't have a very strong investment culture, that it's not that area doesn't necessarily have people who have the ability to be investors. It might be that those people don't recognize that there are companies in their own backyard they could be investing in, or they're putting their money into different types of assets. And so again, having that conversation about making investments is worthwhile. I mentioned signals earlier. So one of the things to think about there is, if you are someone thinking about starting a business in your region, what messages are you seeing from the general public, from the media in the region, about the value of entrepreneurship and about what it means to possibly fail in one of your ventures? So doing things like celebrating successful companies, trying to make it so that companies that weren't successful, that if that's not being covered as some sort of personal failure or something that the company did horribly wrong, but just to the extent that you can, that it's being addressed as something that didn't work out, but that it's not the complete end of the process for that person. So there may be awards initiatives, there may be just looking at what's actually getting covered, putting together PR events. We're pretty used in the economic development world to having a major PR event around a new incentive that's bringing in 100, 1,000 jobs, but celebrating some of the investments that are being made that help a company create just 5 more jobs, that's also something that can send a signal about the value of entrepreneurship. So mentioning through that a handful of initiatives, but just to kind of put a finer point on it, looking at how can you help bring people to the table, how can you help index the entrepreneurship support resources in the region, provide those in a way that's easier for a would-be entrepreneur to identify them, assessing whether something like an incubator and accelerator can be available to provide that education, that mentorship to entrepreneurs. Those are all things that a region, a state, local government could do to be supportive. One of the most powerful vehicles that we've seen for supporting new tech companies is what we call a venture development organization. And so in a nutshell, a venture development organization, or a VDO, is essentially a public-private organization that's mixing capital, technology, transformation support, and entrepreneurial development services. And those three elements are really important. We're talking about, it's also important that the organization have, of course, good governance, that it is focused on a specific region, that it has private sector leadership, so that it's not just being driven by what the public sector feels that they need, but at the same time, it shouldn't just be driven by purely private sector needs either, because that public funding piece and perhaps some other elements of a public and a place-based role can be really important to making sure that it stays focused on a mission, which being focused on impact is incredibly important to a VDO. But what these organizations can do is provide training to entrepreneurs, provide assistance on some of the complex legal and market-based challenges to bring in new technology from the lab to the actual market, finding the right business that's going to ultimately pay for it. And then also ultimately providing capital. Many of the VDOs around the country, they're providing seed capital. So there's some of the first funds into a new company, helping to de-risk the technology, helping to de-risk the team, and then finding follow-on investors that can help really scale that company to the point that it's successful. So some of the VDOs that we look at as effective models are located in the Midwest region. Groups, particularly like Jumpstart and Rev1 Ventures, both of those organizations are based out of Ohio. They bring all of these elements into place that I've talked about. Other groups around the country that do this, there's BioSTL with its kind of sister organization, BioGenerator, that together form a VDO. There's Mass Ventures based out of Boston. You know, that's an area, of course, Boston has a lot of private capital already in place, but the state supports Mass Ventures as a way to support companies that are running counter to the primary market-driven trends and further diversify the base, like Dan was talking about earlier. To get a little bit more specific into ways that VDOs impact local innovation systems, they can nurture that entrepreneurial culture that we've talked about, help more entrepreneurs and other members of the C-suite and startup community develop a better understanding of what it means to run a business, what the market analysis portion of it needs to look at. Building risk tolerance. Many VDOs are going to be investing alongside angels, investing alongside other local funds. And so that can help those groups as well kind of understand beneficial roles for them to be playing in the community. They can be facilitating whether that company's interactions with capital throughout the entire life cycle of the company. So that might be, again, co-investors, follow-on investment, even acquisitions and things as well. So a number of impacts on that side that a VDO can bring out. Another benefit of having a group like that is that it gives other entrepreneurs a place where they know that they can go, a recognized brand, an entry point into what might be a suite of other organizations and support structures that exist throughout the region at that point. That type of role can help develop serial entrepreneurs, can help strengthen other entities up and down that kind of innovation life cycle that Dan spelled out earlier. We oftentimes hear, especially from people that are kind of newer to the idea of a T-bed strategy, a lot of concern around the idea of providing public funds that are going to go to support investment capital. And so the reasons why that is still really important and that it is an appropriate role for tax dollars are spelled out here. One of the main ones is that the private market for investment dollars into startup companies is incredibly concentrated. So if you look at where the majority of VC dollars go, venture capital dollars, VC dollars go in this country, the majority of it is in just 3 states, or even more specifically in about 5 MSAs in the country. So those 5 cities account for well more than 2/3, and in some quarters it gets closer to 80% of venture capital. And so it ends up being really valuable for places in flyover states to provide some of those investment dollars as a kind of matching incentive to pull additional capital off the sides, also to help scale up and start the ball rolling for those companies that are locally grown and could be successful if they had access to additional funding. Otherwise, what you might see is that those people who have good ideas are going to go to the places where the capital are. So trying to correct this geographic concentration is valuable for a T-bed strategy. Another reason why it's justifiable to have public dollars into these types of programs is that typically only about 1% of all possible ventures are going to end up getting funded. And so there is a wealth of effective opportunities that you can be looking at supporting in your own backyard. So while most of the capital is geographically concentrated, like I said, it's not the case that those are all of the good ideas that exist and there's nothing else that's viable in the rest of the country. And so, there's plenty of space kind of below what Silicon Valley, what Boston are picking off to be able to operate effectively. We talk about clusters, talk about different tech areas outside of IT. There are other sectors that a local fund could be specifically focused on. I mentioned Rev1 Ventures in Columbus. They've done a lot of work supporting the insurance sector, which Ohio has quite a few insurance-focused companies, and they've been able to develop that as a little bit of a niche. You see other VDOs that might be more focused on bio issues, which have a very long development cycle, some that are more focused on hardware issues. Innovation Works in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh specifically, has built a really strong hardware-focused fund and accelerator model. So that kind of sector-based shortcoming strategy is another way that you can justify supporting these funds and having them show impact. And again, I mentioned it just kind of briefly earlier, but another important reason to be providing investment and risk capital in a region is that most of these companies in their earliest stages, they're not going to be viable candidates for bank funding. So typically when you talk about debt, you're talking about the 5 C's of lending. And so, these companies aren't going to be showing a strong balance sheet. They're not going to be showing positive revenue. There might not be tangible assets they can put up as collateral. And so for all of those reasons, they're going to need possible support. Final point here is that because so much of the typical VC market is focused on IT, that has a relatively short return. You can get an easier idea of what the kind of time scale is going to be for software much of the time. That tends not to be true in hardware, in biotech, in precision ag, and devices like that may take a little bit longer to bring up to market. Broadly speaking, when you look at approaches to build capital, there's again that kind of convening function that a region can play, state, local government, other partners, putting together forums, conferences that can bring angels, funds, those types of people together with entrepreneurs or by themselves to talk about investing. We see sometimes state-backed entities and VDOs supporting the formation of angel investment groups. Overall, the angel industry is shifting from just individuals putting their own money into deals to more groups coming together around a fund or just as an angel network to make investments. So that's another way that states could possibly be supporting what's going on in this sector. The federal Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR, is the federal government's main tool to support new companies and new tech at this stage. So providing programs, outreach around that program is another way to identify companies and additional dollars that can be leveraged into a company. I want to make a point about tax credits because we see quite a number of states providing tax incentives to angel investors or other funds to provide funding into companies in the state. There has been quite a lot of studies looking at the impact of these programs, and for the most part, that research has not shown more than a short-term benefit. Looking at a long-term strategy, those investment tax credits do not seem to particularly work out well. It's not clear that they're incentivizing additional money to come into an area, maybe just shifting some funds around. And many states haven't done a good job of separating out people who are already vested in those companies from getting the credits versus encouraging truly new dollars in. And so that's another reason to look at putting funds directly into a VDO or a similar organization that can then marshal capital. You spend the same amount of money on in a fund, as you would into an investor tax credit, you should get more bang for your buck. Some states also look at providing direct funding to firms, so grants and loans for applied R&D. again, mention providing money to funds in order to be able to actually invest in companies directly. Offsetting pre-commercialization costs for market analysis, SBR matching programs. Those are other types of tools that have been used throughout the country in order to be able to support new ventures as they move forward, as they figure out how to actually transform their research idea into a viable business. I want to talk for just a moment about a polling project that we did looking at public perceptions of TBED policy, and then open up to questions here. So we did a poll earlier this year, and it was really a repeat of another project we done in 2015 to help show the longevity and the stability of these public perceptions. We gave people a prompt where we talked about, as a country, we're leading the world in scientific and medical research, talk about America's successes, but then the challenge is that unfortunately America's leadership on R&D measures is dropping, and that we're often failing to convert that research into new products, companies, jobs. And then we showed people some ideas that could help address these issues: increasing investment, in scientific research, supporting the transformation of government-funded research in new companies and jobs, providing access to capital for innovative startups. People overwhelmingly supported it. 95% of likely voters across the country supported the platform that we laid out. 46% of voters had strong support. This covered quite a few demographic groups. Basically, everyone was interested in this, regardless of whether you're looking at party, if you're looking at age, other demographics, employment, or what their current financial stability was. People really liked the idea as we laid it out. Interestingly, one of the reasons why people supported it was not that they necessarily saw it as immediately helping them. See, 74% thought that the platform that we had spelled out would help people like them. However, the majority of people thought that it would improve the economy in the future, and specifically for their children or grandchildren. So 88% for the next generation, 92% for the future overall. Some of the specific policies that people supported are the types of things that we're talking about. So ensuring that the workforce is ready for the jobs of the future, 93% support. Making it easier for businesses to transform new ideas into products, 91. Funding programs that would help with that research transformation process, 89% public support. Increasing access to capital for early stage companies, 88%. Increasing federal funding of research, 87%. And then partnerships between the federal government, cities, nonprofits to help fund local strategies to essentially advance the TBED strategy, 87%. So again, this is a poll that we did immediately prior to the pandemic, although again, we feel confident about the long-term stability of the results since this is over 5 years. We saw a very similar bipartisan polling team. Just wanted to share this because if this is something that seems interesting, but maybe seems like it's a little bit high in the sky or a little bit too long-term for people to really care about, we're seeing that actually the public, if you take a moment to talk about the idea with them, really does understand it and is excited about the possibilities. One final note, as Dan mentioned, we know that many of you are under budget pressures right now, and so the idea of investing in a long-term strategy might seem particularly difficult. Wanted to highlight, I mean, hopefully today we've made the case for why you would want to invest in this type of strategy overall, and make it a priority. Wanted to point out that there are federal resources that can help support this type of activity as well, although many of them do require matching funds that are often provided at the state level. So the CDFI fund, Community Development Financial Institutions, that money can also go to venture capital groups. Several VDOs participate in it. We would say not enough, but that is a source of capital. EDA has a program called Built to Scale. There are winners throughout this entire region, including Nebraska and Ohio, as I'm looking at the committee co-chairs here. This is a program that can help support various types of strategies like we've talked about. It can go to entrepreneurial development, it can go to VDOs, it can go to university efforts to transform technology. Looking at manufacturing programs, and Dan mentioned getting tech into new companies. That's one of the roles that NIST's Manufacturing Extension Partnership has. They can help small and mid-sized manufacturers get access to new tech that might help make their processes more efficient or help give them ideas for new products. That is, again, another program that requires a match that most often comes from the state. Many research, I believe it's 11 agencies across the federal government participate in SBIR. As I said, it's the federal government's main program to help advance new technology to the marketplace. SBA has a couple of programs as well. I'll mention them in the other order here. The FAST program helps provide awareness and improve the results from SBIR. That again requires a match and also requires that the state sign off on the applicant who is going to apply to SBA to get this funding. So an important one for state involvement. And SBA also has a regional innovation clusters program that can help advance an innovation-focused strategy to develop tech in a specific sector. So, all right. Thank you very much. That is the end of our slides. I will go ahead and stop sharing here. Dan, one question that came in that I think would be a good one to start with is what metrics would SSTI particularly look at to assess how a region is doing?
Oh, how a region is doing. So I would do it based off of the 7 elements that I talked about earlier. So I'd want to know how a region is doing on its research capacity. So there would be looking at what federal R&D money is flowing into the region. What's the industry R&D spending like in the region? One of the things that I get particularly interested in is how much industrial R&D money is being directed to universities. That becomes a proxy for how closely industry and local universities are working together. On the workforce side, you want to know what the educational attainment of the populace is like. What are the overall demographics like? There are parts of the Midwest that have an issue with an aging population. So trying to understand what's happening with the population overall. And entrepreneurship, it is very difficult. There is some data on startups, but not particularly happy with the quality of that data. And then Jason, I don't know if you want to add anything on the capital side as well.
Yeah, certainly. And also chatting out to the group, SSTI in our weekly digest, we have a running series of what we call useful stats that shares a lot of those metrics that Dan's talking about from public sources. And we always break them out at either the state or the MSA, well, sometimes county level as well. And so sharing that link there so you can follow that up. On capital, we tend to focus more on the number of deals, the number of investment deals that are occurring in a region more than dollars, in part because of some of the private market disparities, also because we feel that deals is a little bit better of an indicator of the volume of activity that's going on, number of startups that are active in a place. So number of deals is certainly one that we look at. Another one that's really helpful to assess and can be done a little bit more easily at a regional level than at a national level is looking at where your investors are coming from. So what portion of deals have local funders that are going into them versus money that's coming from outside. And then also looking at how much of your local investment is going to outside the region. So I talked a bit about the importance of trying to corral your angels and some of your other potential corporate venture investors and getting them to recognize opportunities in their own backyard. One way to get it, whether or not you have an issue, is to see how much investment is coming from within your region and going out to other parts of the country. So those would be other factors to look at. I think on a similar point, it might be worth mentioning, Dan, when it comes to looking at specific programs and their success, what are some of the key factors there? Obviously, there's always lots of concern about jobs, though that's, we tend to think about that very differently, of course, than typical economic development programs.
Yeah, so in terms of metrics and evaluating individual programs, it depends on what the goal of the program is. So, for example, when I was talking about research capacity, looking at job creation on that kind of program isn't fair. That isn't really the best metric for it. There, you'd want to look at What's the quality of the researcher that's being attracted to the institution? Is more federal R&D money coming into the university or the region? For later stage programs like venture development organizations, we did a group discussion of all of the venture development organizations and how they measure their success. And they agreed on, I think it's 3 measures, maybe 4 measures. One is on jobs created. Second is capital raised for companies that they've worked with, and sales for those individual companies. And maybe the 4th was charting all of those over time as well as being the most important metrics.
Hey, Dan and Jason, this is Dave Greenspan up here in the Buckeye State as well. So OH. Hey, question for you guys. We had on one of these panels, Jobs Ohio, and they kind of explained the role they play as far as a job attractor in the state. Can you provide some context and how you see, and you might want to give an overview of Jobs Ohio, but how you see entities like that possibly playing a positive role in what we're talking about?
Sure, absolutely. So Jobs Ohio, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a public-private partnership economic development group funded through the state liquor profits, and their primary role is to serve as the company recruiter to the state. And as I said in my earlier comments, the recruitment can play a very significant role in the development of a tech-focused economy. It becomes a question of how much cooperation, collaboration there is between the entities working on developing the tech-based economy and the recruitment organization. So give you a couple examples. One good example, one bad example. South Carolina recruited BMW to the state, and they had very strategic plan of building up the university capacity, both research capacity and training programs, in order to feed into that plan. I think all in all, a successful recruitment that helped transform part of a state. Not good example. 15 years ago, the state of Florida recruited the Scripps Research Institute from California to open a new facility in Florida. They spent $300 million to get this facility to locate, and it's been hard to see any kind of economic benefit from that. I think the difference between the South Carolina example and the Florida example is South Carolina was very intentional, very strategic about what they were doing and built up an infrastructure around that recruitment. Whereas Florida operated under a philosophy of, if we bring this here, we'll become a tech mecca and we don't need to do anything else. So that'd be my take on it. Jason, anything you want to add to that?
I would just also say that we see states integrate the tech-based portion of their strategy and the overall economic development strategy to different degrees. To some extent, Jobs Ohio has some overlaps, but also some of the activity that happens in Ohio that's focused on innovation happens through different entities. Some states, again, have that integrated a little bit more. Michigan Economic Development Corporation would be an example of a group that in a lot of ways wears similar hats to Jobs Ohio and has the state level TBED strategy much more integrated than perhaps what you see in our state, speaking as an Ohioan. And so they have an office that does provide funds directly to groups that are like VDOs, that supports university research centers, whereas there are different entities that, again, take over some of those functions in the state.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Laura, do we have any other questions before we turn it over to you to close out?
We don't at this time. I guess we'll give everybody one last chance to either raise your hand or submit a question. If not, we'll wrap up. Senator, did you have anything?
No, I don't. Great presentation. Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, it doesn't look like we're getting anything there, so we'll wrap up. I want to thank both Dan and Jason for being with us today and for the information that they provided. I just want to point out that earlier I did put a link in the chat for SSTI's Weekly Digest. And this is not a paid advertisement, but I do highly recommend that you check out that and bookmark it. You can also get it emailed to you. It is one of my top go-to resources on news, on tech-led economic news. And I just urge you to read it. You can find out what's going on all across the nation. It's a wonderfully done part of their website. So I just wanted to give that little plug in there. Thank you, Senator McAllister. Thank you, Representative Greenspan, for your time and your leadership once again. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I do want to make you aware of another event that we have coming up that you might be interested in, and it is sponsored by our MLC Midwest Canada Relations Committee next week on Tuesday, October 13th at 10 a.m. Central. They will be hosting a virtual meeting on the USMCA trade agreement. And Jenny just posted the link for registration in there, but you can also find the registration on our CSG Midwest website. Thanks again, and I think for the remainder of my day, I'm going to take some of Dan's advice. I'm going to try to do some good work. I'm going to try not to do anything stupid, and I just hope that you all have a great day too, and that you stay safe, and that we see you soon. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.